Hello everyone, Nick the DM here. Welcome to the second part of the Demon series. In this video, we are taking a look at the largest and most well-known of the Demon subtypes, the Tanar'ri. There are three different ways you can pronounce it. It's the Tanar'ri, the Tanar'ri, and the Tanar'ri. I probably switch between, but I imagine I go more with the final, or the latter of those options. Before we get into it, you may notice a good number of repeated topics between this video and the generic Demon video. This is because 2nd edition renamed Demons to Tanar'ri because of the satanic panic of the 1980s and the religious fears around having a game involving demons. Originally, this was a complete renaming for all things demons, but as of 3rd edition, the name Demon was brought back, but they kept the Tanar'ri just as a subtyping of the demon species. However, as a result of this, all demon lore in 2nd edition was exclusively covering the Tanar'ri. And because of that, some things like summoning, as an example, or ascension had different specifics than that of generic demons, even if it was just lore changes between editions. But regardless, all of that is in this video to completely cover the Tanar'ri, so let's get into it. The Abyss has hundreds of layers, each with a bewildering array of fearsome demons. Though all embrace the path of evil, the Tanar'ri stand as the supreme villains within the abyssal hierarchy of inquiry. The Tanar'ri are the largest and most diverse group of demons. Unchallenged masters of the Abyss, they are considered the most powerful group of demons and form the core of many demonic armies. Their legions spill into nearly every layer of the chaotic plane, and they believe themselves to be the superior race in the multiverse. Tanar'ri are, in the broadest terms, chaos and evil defined. The less intelligent often attack without question and continue to do so until slain. The Tanar'ri are chaotic evil personified. As such, they are not motivated by doctrines, but instead by insane, violent inner drives. They tempt mortals into crimes of passion and vice, evils of appetite. For the most part, the Tanar'ri just rage. They drip with emotional venom, and within their spirits burns a nameless and formless flame. Some scholars say the Tanar'ri act the way they do because they're trying to expel their fury and passion, looking to gain respite through destruction. Ironically, when they try this, it just makes the flame burn brighter. Some say that is why the Tanar'ri are crazed. They can never hope to express themselves adequately enough to cast out their hatred and fear. While a mortal can cry or shriek or kill and fully vent their pent-up emotions, at least for a time, a Tanar'ri never finds that relief. The rage just builds and builds throughout the long years of existence. Elder scholars figure that only the suffering of others helps to alleviate the strain. That's why the fiends wreak so much havoc. Some Tanar'ri even try to paint themselves as a tragic figure, but those fooled by that should rethink their assessment of the fiend. The Tanar'ri are in the Abyss because they choose to be. They aren't misunderstood victims. They consistently and thoroughly put their wants above the needs of others, and the only thing that scares them back into line is the threat of a power greater than their own. The Tanar'ri are selfish and evil scum, and if they suffer, they've brought it on themselves. Besides, they like to hurt and kill. That drive overrides almost anything else in their existence. It's their one true love. They will bury themselves in other passions, but their ruling desire is pain. If it soothes their supposed suffering, fine. If not, that's fine for them too. They inflict it on others just the same. That should be more than enough to keep any individual from pitying the Tanar'ri. Some think that the Tanar'ri are too chaotic to have foresight, but that's not true. They can act with logic and efficiency, sometimes in short bursts, sometimes making plans over long centuries. Due to their nature, the Tanar'ri tend to think of themselves rather than the bigger picture, preferring to bask in the heat of the moment. Some say that one of the best ways to destroy a Tanar'ri is through planning. Since the demons are unable to make plans, they fall for them easily. That's utterly untrue and is most likely a rumor spread by the Tanar'ri themselves. The Tanar'ri can and do make plans, even making plots that span centuries of work. It's just that they don't work together unless it suits them. They don't build for future generations or the good of the race. They focus only on themselves and on increasing their own power. They have no armies in the truest sense of the word, just hordes of millions of fiends whipped into service by cruel acts and fierce wills. No central command leads their forces into battle. Power rests with the true Tanar'ri and the Abyssal Lords, who often pursue their own agendas at the cost of victory. Not to delve too much into the Blood War, that will be its own video, but some scholars believe the Tanar'ri stand little chance against the cautious planning of the Beatezu in the long run. Others guess that the opposite is true. With the Tanar'ri's nearly uncountable forces, they can afford to wage sloppy war. Part of the reason the Beatezu have made little progress in the Blood War is because of the very chaos they despise. The lawful evil devils are too steeped in the ideas of law and order to understand how the Tanar'ri even exist, let alone prosper, when they often don't know what they'll do next. Despite studying chaos theory, hiring Zeosotex, and jumping through all sorts of hoops in the hope of better understanding their chaotic enemies, even the devils cannot make any progress into understanding the nature of the Tanar'ri. Yet I am still for some reason making this video. Purveyors of ill intent and creatures of utter cruelty, the Tanar'ri are some of the, if not the, most mean-spirited and thoroughly evil monsters in existence. They view life as a nuisance, and see the living as toys to be savagely abused and then discarded. They care for nothing but themselves, and they don't even care about themselves all that much. The Tanar'ri act only based on their own desires, and whatever hidden motives drives those desires are so corrupt and depraved that an individual would be better off not knowing anything about them. The Tanar'ri rule almost all layers of the Abyss. In the Abyss, where others endure endless torment, the Tanar'ri thrive. The varieties of Tanar'ri alone are more than any mortal can hope to list or discover, but the sheer size and number of the layers of the Abyss guarantees enough space for them and other creatures, such as other kinds of demons and even creatures like the undead Bodax. Culture. Anyone seeking to understand the Tanar'ri must remember the nature of the Abyss. Chaos. Anything can and usually does happen there. The Tanar'ri watch their backs in all directions, constantly alert to any possibility, expecting the worst probably because that's what usually comes to pass. They lay plans and discard them just as quickly. The Tanar'ri adapt themselves to any situation. That's how they're bred. Their culture, if one can call anything the Tanar'ri do a culture, reflects just that. It surges in all directions, anticipating nothing and ready for everything, destroying itself from within when there are no threats from without. The Blood War is mainly just a diversion for the Tanar'ri, a way to focus their anger beyond their own kind and onto those who represent the law and order they so hate. The key to understanding the Tanar'ri is this. Each fiend believes that it, and it alone, knows the true answer to existence, the real meaning of life. And they try to teach by example. This has been heard from enough different Tanar'ri to assume that it's true among all Tanar'ri. In the case, however unlikely, that it is not, this would mean the Tanar'ri are all identically confused or have rallied around a common lie, and they are too wildly individual for that. Thus it is believed that this certainty of truth is what drives the Tanar'ri to their nefarious deeds. Though some of the lesser Tanar'ri simply exist to torture, maim, and kill, those with any intelligence seek the answers for themselves and then try to impress that knowledge upon others. They're not looking to enlighten, but only to spread the doctrine of chaos. And the only way they know how to do that is through their personal torment and experience. Of course, this is another factor along with their internal rage mentioned earlier. To find out just how bad the Tanar'ri are, Take the worst mortal murderer, the most amoral human monster imaginable. Imagine all the horrors he's committed on his victims, wearing their skins, devouring their bodies, and other unspeakable acts, and multiply that by 100, 1,000. That mindless callousness and disregard for others, coupled with savage delight in pain and suffering, merely scratches the surface of the Tanar'ric mindset. While most mortals who commit reprehensible actions usually feel some twinge of guilt, the Tanar'ri revel in the misery they inflict. Some experts claim that the Tanar'ri act as they do because the fiends need to express their inner rage at being trapped in such hideous forms, similar to what I mentioned earlier. Those who make this argument don't seem to understand that most Tanar'ri like their shapes. They're adaptable and powerful. One explanation on the Tanar'ri character is this: the fiends lash out because they're weary of being repressed by tougher fiends. Now, some Tanar'ri may accept or enjoy harsh oppression from the mighty, and the Tanar'ri at the top of the chain aren't any nicer than the rest of them, even if they experience less oppression. They're still nasty just for the sake of nastiness. But that's one of the reasons the Abyssal Lords scratched their way to the top in the first place, so they wouldn't have to take orders from anyone. In fact, it's one of the few redeeming qualities of the Abyss. The fiends there are all individuals, and they fight with such ferocity because they're upholding their personal visions. The value of those visions is another matter entirely. They can be admired for that much. There isn't much else to admire. Aesthetics. One of the other few places that the Tanar'ri shine is aesthetics. The chaotic fiends produce art that, while not pleasing, pretty, or even able to be considered art in some cases, is always disturbing and thought-provoking. Their painting, architecture, music, poems, and stories are a hodgepodge of conflicting images and themes, each of which portrays some new atrocity even more twisted than the one before. There are some exceptions. Occasionally, a denizen of the Abyss produces a work of undeniable appeal that touches hearts across the planes. Some examples: the Cambion Olistaire's epic poem Into the Dread Styx is a moving testament to loyalty, betrayal, and loss. Another is the series of cameos painted by the Nalfeshni judge Quixit of the mortal petitioners brought before her. The images are delicate and loving, showing a measure of compassion unthinkable in the Tanar'ri. Though the medium was unrevealed by the scholars that witnessed the work, it's said that the medium left something to be desired. In short, the Tanar'ri aesthetic mirrors their lives as all good art should: unpredictable and jagged and harsh and soft and flowing and clean and messy all at the same time. It's a mixture of jarring contrasts where the audience expects smooth transitions, as well as jarring contrasts where the audience expects jarring contrast. One can no more describe the Tanar'ri aesthetic than they can explain the dreams of the wind. The Tanar'ri are beyond definition, but they produce very interesting art. Society. The Tanar'ri have no society as we understand it, at least none that spans the whole plane. There is nothing more than what an ambitious Tanar'ri can carve out for itself and hold on to for a time. And even that can only endure if the next fiend to come along, the successor to the visionary, has the ability to hold it together, to twist it for selfish ends. Nothing in the Abyss is meant to endure. Some small kingdoms do exist throughout the plane, and some fiefdoms cover entire layers. But where the Beatezu rally around one single unifying principle, the Tanar'ric instinct encourages divisiveness and chaos by its very nature, and the imposition of a single society goes against every drop of blood the Tanar'ri possess. Of course, if a powerful Abyssal Lord were to unite the layers and impose their will over the entire plane, the Tanar'ri, theoretically at least, would be under a single ruler. Certain Abyssal Lords have already claimed multiple layers, like graz'zt, who has 3 layers under his rule. However, it is unlikely any rulers will claim too many layers. That kind of domination would surely cause the lesser Tanar'ri to rise up and cast out the one who would crush their freedoms. The Tanar'ri are capable of united action, after all. A lord who would control more than a handful of layers would need nearly undisputed power to keep those already under their control in line. Laws. Those looking for laws within the Abyss, probably those of the Fraternity of Order, would have better luck finding evil in Elysium. The only kind of law among the Tanar'ri is the Tanar'ri, by which I mean that each Tanar'ri is a law unto itself, each seeking its own way and its own truth or deceit, as the case may be. They each rebel against the higher powers and kick and kill until they can claim total freedom for themselves. They each act as their own judge, jury, and executioner, and pity anyone who breaks their laws. The way each of these so-called laws is established is unknown, probably even to the Tanar'ri. They invent their lives over and over again with each breath they draw. They don't believe in consistency. That would pin them down, force them to be something they're not. The Tanar'ri believe in making their own rules. That way, only they can tell when they're breaking them. The Tanar'ri are crazy naturally and are trying desperately to get even more so, to throw off the shackles of restraint. Though crazy is too strong a word, the Tanar'ri are too canny to be dismissed as simple lunatics. But then, only one word can describe a whole race of creatures with no structure: chaotic. The Abyss is filled with the plotting and scheming of the Tanar'ri. Plotting and scheming against one another, fighting mad battles to the death and beyond. The Lesser Tanar'ri do this constantly. The Higher Tanar'ri, and even the Abyssal Lords, plot, scheme, and fight just as much. They just prefer to do it with more subtlety than the weaker Tanar'ri. And when subtlety fails, it's not hard for a Layer's Lord to round up a squad of warriors and lay siege to a rival's fortress. Fortresses and the such are innumerable among the layers of the Abyss, some built of iron, others of fire-hardened and magically enhanced clay, and some of serpents mortared together with the essence of pain. It seems there is no substance that hasn't been used to create a fortress, but all of them have been treated and tested to stand true. After all, sieges come frequently in the Abyss. Hardly a day goes by without an assault on some castle somewhere. It may be a matter of territory or insults or simply mean-spiritedness. It could also have no reason at all, such as the Tanar'ri. They act as they will. Because it's nearly impossible for the Tanar'ri to prepare themselves for all the attacks that might come, they try to hold their enemies at bay with politics. They hope to buy time to marshal their defenses, offenses, or supposed allies. Political maneuvering is one of the few ways they can forestall a war until they're ready. Of course, the Tanar'ri don't have the complicated, rigorous political systems favored by the Beatezu. Quite the opposite. In fact, politics in the Abyss is just a matter of who holds the greater power, in numbers, strength, magic, and reach, or who appears to. The Tanar'ri throw their loyalty, however loyal that may be, toward the stronger side unless they're personally threatened or believe that they're going to be threatened. In that case, they try to convince their fellows that they are the strongest in order to gain allies against the apparent usurper. When a Tanar'ri rises quite high in the Abyss, it has to start downplaying its power while still maintaining its real strength. The Tanar'ri like nothing better than toppling whatever someone else has built high. An abyssal fiend that portrays itself as almighty will soon find its limits tested by foes at every turn. Then again, if the fiend makes itself out to be too weak, that also opens the door to assault. It's a delicate balance. Strangely enough, the most powerful among the Tanar'ri often do it so well that they fool themselves. They feign strength and weakness as the need arises, but in order to be truly convincing, they must believe their own stories. And it goes beyond merely putting on a good show. Remember, in the Abyss, as it is on the rest of the Outer Planes, strong belief can turn dreams into reality. The different castes of Tanar'ri, least, lesser, greater, true, and guardian, take on some importance in the arena of abyssal politics. Though the tables are really just broad estimates of power, the Tanar'ri themselves sometimes flaunt the terms to frighten a foe or put its mind at ease. For example, an Alufiend might tell a band of Dretches that they are only least Tanar'ri, that they've got no chance against a lesser Tanar'ri such as herself. Of course, if that same Alufiend encounters a Nebesu, she'll do her best to convince it that the rankings are meaningless. In short, abyssal politics are based on the Tanar'ri doing whatever they need to from moment to moment in order to survive and thrive. Origin. Starting with the Tanar'ri origin in 2nd edition. The Forbidden Yugoloth text, the Book of Derelict Magics, a source whose authenticity and accuracy is often questioned, claims that the so-called perfection of the Yugoloths was threatened by the meddlesome hands of law and chaos. The early Yugoloths had to contend with warring natures and questions of ethics in their pursuit of perfection. One of the first Ultraloths came up with a solution. It would expunge all law and chaos from its race. It did this with the creation of a magic stone called the Heart of Darkness. The Ultraloth removed all traces of law and chaos from its fellow Yugoloths, passing the purged energies into the multitudinous larvae it had collected. These larvae grew and mutated, the forces of law and chaos twisting them into impure mockeries of the Yugoloths. And the Ultraloth drove them from the Grey Waste. The mutated creatures filled with law made their way to Beator, while those infused with chaos journeyed to the Abyss. The larvae were said to change further, becoming creatures more suited to their new environments, until all on a plane became part of the same race. Thus did the Beatorian larva become the Beatezu, and the Abyssal larva become the Tanar'ri. Many millions of each race were formed, though most of the new creatures have no way to spawn more of their kind, for only a few varieties can breed. The Book of Derelict Magics also claims that these creations, while varied in form and purpose, still carry the essence of the Yugoloths, and thus will be controlled when the Yugoloths are ready to extend their domain over the plains. They are said to control these two races by means of a mysterious being called the Meldur et Kavarik. It is through the grace of the Meldur that the Beatezu and Tanar'ri are able to teleport across the plains at will. And should the Yugoloths ever decide to reassert dominion over the fledgling fiends, they will look to the Meldur for the way. The Beatezu histories, however, claim that the Beatezu and the Tanar'ri sprang full-born from the hearts of their home plains. Few Tanar'ri histories exist. Those that do are too muddled and exaggerated to be of much use. Unknown to either side, both Tanar'ri and Beatezu charge certain members of their race with the accumulation of knowledge. Among the Tanar'ri, this position is filled by whoever wants it, and histories are rewritten to fill the motives of whoever's in power at the moment. Petitioners of the lower planes are spirits of creatures from the material plane, a place long unknown to the fiends. These spirits had been arriving on the lower planes, their power weak and their knowledge lacking. Millennia of fighting in the Blood War passed before the petitioners first arrived on the Abyss, and the fiends discovered a use for these petitioners. The most evil of the spirits became larvae. Others were granted various shapes by wicked deities. But in all cases, the fiends merely made sport of eating or maiming the new creatures. It's said that the Beatezu first began to experiment on the petitioners, discovering that the petitioners that became larvae could be twisted into the forms of lesser Beatezu and then made to serve in armies. Of course, this information leaked to the Tanar'ri. It is suspected that the Yugoloths had some hand in the information leaking, but there's no proof. The Tanar'ri began their own experiments on the abyssal larva, and found that the creatures were particularly easy to mold into lesser Tanar'ri, but quite hard to control. Once cowed by the greater power of the fiends, however, they are putty in a master's hands. This was a turning point for both the Beatezu and the Tanar'ri in their histories. For the first time, they realized that they could swell their own populations, that they needn't worry so much about casualties of war. 3.5e, however, credits the origin of the Tanar'ri to the Obyriths, the first race of demons. It is said that when the spirits of dead, chaotic evil mortals first began to emerge on the Abyss, the Obyriths quickly learned to shape them. and by enhancing the evil and chaos they found within these spirits, they created the first Tanar'ri. Now, I'm skipping a little bit here that we'll cover more in the Obyrith video, but it's not completely relevant to the Tanar'ri, so we're just moving on. Not long after the ancient Obyrith demons were defeated and scattered, and the Queen of Chaos was defeated on the fields of Pesh, the Abyss lay depopulated. Eladrin armies swept through the infinite layers of the Abyss in a furious crusade to crush and destroy everything they could find in the wake of that historic defeat. And as a result, the Obyrith race was very nearly obliterated. Yet even such a colossal loss did nothing more than register as a stutter in the vile abundant growth of the Abyss. The Obyriths had been removed from power, but their Tanar'ri creations, demons fed and fattened by the sins of mortal life, were ready to claim the Abyss as their home. The domination of the Abyss was swift, occurring in the blink of a cosmic eye. Unlike the Obyriths, who had crawled wet and ruinous from the, and I quote from Dragon Magazine issue 353, quote, heaving birth flesh, unquote, of the Abyss itself, the Tanar'ri grew from a more fertile soil, the mortal soul. As countless mortals lived and sinned and died, their wicked souls created an endless influx of raw material for the Abyss to shape. Many of these were coaxed and shaped into being by the Obyriths with the aid of the flesh-warping Sybriax Obyriths. The process continues to this day, often with transitory Tanar'ri breeds emerging from new depravities and mortal failings, only to go extinct without even coming to the attention of the material plane scholars who mistakenly consider themselves experts in all things demonic. Yet certain sins are ageless and do not vary no matter how much time passes. Certain Tanar'ri are said to come from specific sins. These Tanar'ri form the bulk of demonic life on the Abyss. Wrath creates hateful Vrox, envy the power-hungry Glabrezu, gluttony brings forth the ravenous Nabesus, alcoliths come from sloth, those possessed of mortal lust become succubi, and so on and so on. The ways Tanar'ri come to exist, not the beginning of the race, as we just covered, but the creation of the lowest ranking Tanar'ri, are detailed in Advanced D&D 2nd Edition Faces of Evil, The Fiends. When a mortal who devoted their life to chaos and evil dies, they become a petitioner, and their spirit finds its way to the outer plane that most closely matches the essence of their former being, the Abyss. If, in life, the petitioner worshipped a particular abyssal deity, they end up in that power's realm and are transformed into a shape of that god's choosing, perhaps even their original form. Or, if the mortal did not pledge their life to any one power, their spirit becomes a disgusting larva, which is still considered a petitioner. The new larva appears in the Mountain of Woe, the 400th layer of the Abyss, where it is judged by pompous Nalfeshni according to the following guidelines. Number 1. Spirits with little promise become manes, fit only as food or supremely expendable soldiers. Like larvae, manes are still considered petitioners. Number 2. Spirits that seem sufficiently evil and malleable become dretches, honest-to-goodness members of the fiendish race. Number 3. Especially proud spirits that need to learn humility and humiliation become rudderkin, mightier than either manes or dretches, but also more reviled. Of course, the judges don't always follow these guidelines, they are Tanar'ri after all. And how do chaotic Nilfeshni accurately judge the hosts of larvae that swarm before them? Well, they probably don't. Now, they claim to be able to spot the best and most promising larvae, the ones that will surely make the finest Tanar'ri, but that's doubtful. More than likely, their decisions are completely arbitrary. The Tanar'ri have established a method of selection that's really just a dark mockery of a lawful ordered system. The Nalfeshni transform just about all the larvae that appear before them. That's part of the reason the Tanar'ri so staggeringly outnumber the Beatezu, who apply much stricter standards when it comes to choosing larvae. Fewer acceptable larvae means fewer Beatezu. Despite being formed from what were once mortals, most Tanar'ri cannot remember or don't care to remember their material plane origins. The petitioners in the Abyss are horrible. They think of mercy as a form of humor. Abyssal petitioners, those not transformed into mains, are a foul bunch of killers, thugs, traitors, and poisoners. Those that can survive rubbing shoulders with the Tanar'ri are as tough as coffin nails. Most of them suffer from raging ambition or just plain old rage, which makes them both dangerous and reliable. If someone is clever, they can manipulate these creatures to keep themselves safe. When a Tanar'ri or another abyssal inhabitant asks an individual awkward questions, the best thing to do is to change the subject to the Tanar'ri's enemies, even if the individual doesn't know who they are. In the Abyss, everyone is looking over their shoulders. Of course, not all Tanar'ri arise from petitioners. The Tanar'ri have other advantages too, when it comes to the numbers game. They blossom spontaneously from the chaotic maelstrom of the Abyss, much more frequently than the Beatezu spring from the rigid ground of Beator. And many types of Tanar'ri can breed to produce young naturally. The Tanar'ri often get involved with the night hag trade of soul larvae for a few reasons. The Tanar'ri are not picky when promoting soul larvae and do so for almost all the chaotic evil larvae, so it seems strange to think that they'd need to buy more. Well, this is because most chaotic evil larvae are said to be unable to keep their new forms for long and revert back into larvae and merge with the Abyss. It's mentioned in Dragon Annual Issue 2 that the more stable, neutral evil larvae keep their new forms, so the Tanar'ri are better off buying them. The Tanar'ri, however, claim that the only reason they buy larvae from the hags is to make it hard for the Beatezu to get larvae. The Tanar'ri state that they simply end up further frustrating the Beatezu by forcing them into a larva purchasing rivalry. Procreation. Most types of Tanar'ri are formed when weaker fiends advance and take on new shapes, but the Tanar'ri can and do breed among themselves. Armanites couple after slaughtering Beatezu, Graz'zt are carefully mated by their masters so as to produce young, and Chasme lay eggs. Tanar'ri born naturally are, of course, true planar beings from the first moment of life, unlike the abyssal petitioners mentioned earlier. When two Tanar'ri mate, the offspring is usually born into the same rank as the parents, or, if the parents are of two different types, they are born into a rank somewhere in between. In the latter case, the youngling often favors the mother's status, for she is the one who carries the child and influences it until the day it's born. Thankfully for the rest of the planes, many trueborn Tanar'ri are killed by their parents soon after birth, although some do survive to adulthood. The methods and periods of gestation vary. Some Tanar'ric mothers carry a child for mere days before disgorging it onto the plains of the Abyss. Others carry their babies to term over decades, allowing the offspring time to grow and fester in the womb like overripe fruit on a loathsome tree. As with so many other features of the Abyss, reproduction is a chaotic affair, and one that could spell no good end for the childbearer unless protected against the coming of the offspring. Of course, something we can't overlook is the fact that Tanar'ri love to mate with members of countless mortal races as well, using seduction, disguise, brute force, unholy pacts, or whatever other means. The abyssal fiends can crossbreed with pretty much every mortal race. Their natures seem able to override the most compelling biological barriers. Mortal fathers are often slain after the coupling, and mortal mothers rarely survive the birth of their infernal children. 3.5e also says that the first Tanar'ri were forged from the souls of the first humanoids drawn into the Abyss, and most Tanar'ri incorporate humanoid features into their forms as a result of their close ties to the mortal realms. Which brings us to form. The many forms of Tanar'ri spring up from the Abyss. Their rage and hatred seems to be born of the plane itself. They need to be tough to survive the horrors of their home. Tanar'ri are capricious and cruel. The Beatezu like to twist words, the Tanar'ri like to twist necks. They're killers, plain and simple, and they do what they want, when they want, and to whoever they want to. Masters of chaos and purveyors of painful death, the Tanar'ri rule the abyss with savage whim and fierce delight, full of hatred and bile towards every living and some non-living thing. These fiends revel in anarchy and evil for the sake of their own twisted desires. How many different kinds of Tanar'ri exist? Nearly 36 kinds have been identified, but there are almost certainly more. The scholar Mitchell Kettle from Faces of Evil the Fiends bets their week's wages that there are more kinds of Tanar'ri than there are portals on Sigil, trees on Arborea, gears on Mechanus, and so on. The Tanar'ri are nothing if not changeable. Their new forms are as mutable as the wind, and they constantly force themselves into new shapes and new powers. There is only one rule to the shapes of the Tanar'ri: form is slave to function. Since the very birth of the multiverse itself, the Tanar'ri have adapted themselves to the harshness of the abyss. The race has a set standard of shapes, ones that appear often enough to make folks think that the Tanar'ri have an organized system, but for every form we see, we can assume there must be 50 we don't. Or more. It is believed that each layer of the abyss spawns particular shapes suited to living there. Mitchell Kettle even pokes fun at some prime material people who classify the Tanar'ri by type 1, type 2, and so on, quoted as saying, quote, "I can't decide which is greater, the irony of trying to pin one of the most haphazard races in the cosmos to the wall like dead butterflies, or the arrogance of the primes in thinking they could do it in the first place." End quote. In the ever-changing chaos of the abyss, the Tanar'ri must adapt or die. When fiendish life arises spontaneously on one of the layers, it's because the larvae there have managed to evolve to such an extent that they can survive. On some layers, this is, of course, more difficult. Generations of larvae appear and die again and again, growing tougher until finally one of them rises up and assumes a form that can exploit the layer's harsh conditions. The shapes commonly taken by the Tanar'ri are the most well-suited for the hazards of the abyss, forms that can survive in more than one specialized setting. Tanar'ri that evolve into Vroks can function well in environments of land or air, while those that become Wastroliths are best suited for water, and Alkaliths don't seem suited for any environment known to mortals, but thrives in its own part of the abyss. This may not be an automatic evolution. Mitchell Kettle theorizes that the newer Tanar'ri take their cues from the strength and staying power of the most experienced members of the race. They slowly shape themselves into forms that have the best chance of survival in their home layers. Later on, they may take other forms, but only when they have the energy to spare. It is foolish to assume that the Tanar'ri have any mutual defining characteristics. Their very nature defies definition. The organs of one abyssal fiend are not the organs of another. The skin of one has no bearing on the skin of another. Far easier than classifying the similarities and differences between the various types of Tanar'ri is classifying the similarities and differences between the many layers of the abyss. That is where the Tanar'ri learn which forms to adopt and which to flee from, after all. Some layers of the abyss are small. Not all are the infinite expanses most folk seem to expect, and the Tanar'ri that live there may all share the same forms, unable to leave or evolve. Some layers support no life at all. They all have their own themes, and they're all inimical to life in their own way. Many of the earliest Tanar'ri, like Demogorgon, Juoblex, the Alkaliths, and the Myrmixicus, had few, if any, humanoid aspects. The raw chaos of the abyss left them primeval and monstrous. Other Tanar'ri bear the mark of Sybriax alterations and have an almost mechanical aspect to parts of their bodies, such as the Hezru and Glabrizu, both of which have half-organic armor plating under their flesh. But the fact that all Tanar'ri, in some way or another, have as their genesis the evil of a mortal mind perhaps makes them the most frightening demons of all. Physical attributes. The Tanar'ri forms have no pattern because their existence has no pattern. Some types of Tanar'ri are wholly unique. For example, a humanoid fiend bound about with rings of cold fire and dripping with lightning is to be avoided at all costs. Though it is not a well-known creature, this is the dread knight-errant, and to see it is to see death. It allows no one who looks on it to live, no matter how far it must hunt those who try to flee. However, just because all Tanar'ri can be different, that doesn't mean someone clever can't understand a Tanar'ri's function by looking at it. Many of these physical clues are fairly obvious, some are more subtle and remain hidden from the simple and careless, and some are nearly impossible to discern without the inside knowledge of an expert. Some obvious clues are as follows. Sharp claws, horns, and teeth indicate the Tanar'ri comes from a lair that encourages close-up fighting, and often means the demon in question probably believes bloodshed and pain are worthwhile pursuits. The ability to conjure fire from nothing probably means the Tanar'ri is comfortable around fire and would either be resistant or immune to such damage. The Tanar'ri's style of movement can reveal a great amount about its character and environment. Whether it slides, stumbles around, or leaps great distances can let the more observant know about which are the prey and predators of a lair, the dangers found there, and what is most likely to be the best way for a traveler to get around said lair. A Tanar'ri covered in spikes and another covered in slime are likely from lairs that are far different from one another, and what substance the spikes are, bone, metal, might reveal the most common material of their native lair. On to some of the more subtle clues. A Tanar'ri with sparkling eyes and a distant stare could be from a lair where it's necessary to see into the infrared, or that demon has the ability to see magic wherever it goes. Faceted eyes may let a Tanar'ri see in many different directions, or even see different realities, or detect things like heat, cold, fury, peace. While it's hard to discern the specific function of the eyes, special eyes will normally mean special vision. Snaky appendages, ones without bones or fingers, will warn you that the Tanar'ri is a quick mover, that it can attack with blinding speed or strike like a whip, and it may also have venom. Finally, some of the nearly impossible to detect clues. A Tanar'ri with a strange neck and oddly shaped ears might be able to induce sound waves that can shake the earth and collapse structures, or even a foe's blood vessels, depending on the frequency and volume of the waves. If a Tanar'ri can stand at a certain angle in particular kinds of light and appear to vanish, they are likely native to a lair with fearsome predators that have poor senses. And a Tanar'ri with an awkward walking gait may have just overindulged itself on a victim and be feeling a bit lethargic. That is the best time to strike or escape. Biological sex. In my fiend video, I mentioned that most fiends will switch between any and all pronouns in reference to themselves whenever they feel like. But to go even further than that, Tanar'ri can change their biological sex at will. Some days male, some days female. Some days neither, and some days both. Though, as I stated in my fiends video, there are very few ways to tell visually. As a Tanar'ri gets older, they tend to stick to one. Some say that this implies order or stability among the Tanar'ri, but others argue that it's an example of the Tanar'ri letting the strongest urge dominate, as they do in other aspects of their life. Now, changing their sex isn't as easy as switching shoes. It takes a considerable amount of effort, even for the mightiest members of the race. That's another reason a Tanar'ri might make a choice and stick with it. It would much rather use its power for destruction than waste energy on switching its biology. Rankings. Like the Beatezu, the Tanar'ri are broken into a rough hierarchy: least, lesser, greater, guardian, and true Tanar'ri. The Tanar'ri don't really obey anything, especially a system of castes and stations. Some say this is a story spread by those who can't help but find an order for everything in existence. The Abyss has no common hierarchy. The Tanar'ri have no easy classifications. But their ranking has nothing to do with their standing in the Abyss and actually means little in their lives, and has everything to do with the sheer physical power at a fiend's command. They are merely broad estimates of destructive power, the Tanar'ri have little use for anything besides power, and a strong lesser Tanar'ri who bests a greater cousin gains higher status in the Abyss. Their petty battles for position are endless. The only class free from these power struggles is the Molly-Deus, a guardian Tanar'ri that seems curiously divorced from the Tanar'ri power. Least Tanar'ri. Among the hordes of the Abyss, the least of the Tanar'ri are the Manes, the Rudderkin, and the Dretches, the most expendable fighters in the Blood War. Actually, the Manes aren't even considered Tanar'ri at all by some members of the race. They're just mindless petitioners twisted into sickening shapes by the influence of the Abyss. Their only saving grace is that they're savage and unrelenting fighters, charging anything that's not a Tanar'ri and tearing it to pieces. The Rudderkin share the same mania, misshapen humanoids who wander the Abyss, attacking any unwelcome trespassers who cross their paths. Cast out by their fellow Tanar'ri, the ugly Rudderkin aren't even made to fight in the war, serving only as guards on their home plane. The Dretches aren't much better, but they at least can think and enjoy some status as Tanar'ri. Dretches serve as both food and the primary infantrymen in the war. Their pathetic numbers fill out the vast ranks of the armies. A Dretch won't flee a battle if it spots a true or greater Tanar'ri nearby. It wants to improve its standing in the eyes of its betters. Zanzos the Blue Slad says that 1 in every 1,000 Manes becomes a Dretch, and a Dretch will rise to become a Rudderkin. This is contradictory to the earlier information about there not being a strict order to the ranks of the Tanar'ri evolution. Lesser Tanar'ri. The Lesser Tanar'ri come in all shapes and sizes. The weakest among them are the Mortal Tanar'ri crossbreeds. That is what you get when a Tanar'ri goes lusting for a new sensation or a mortal goes lusting for power. The weakest of these are the Alufiends. This strata, as of 2nd edition, includes the Alufiends, Armanites, Bulazau, Barlgura, Cambions, Marizi, Succubi, and Yochlol. Greater Tanar'ri. The Greater Tanar'ri are the fiends who, through cunning, self-promotion, or lucky birth, have risen to a position of real power. They are tough creatures, and they do not fit into easy groupings. The ranking of Greater Tanar'ri is filled by the Babaus, Chasme, Garistroi, Nabesus, and Wastroliths. Guardian Tanar'ri. The only known type of Guardian Tanar'ri is the Molly-Deus. I won't detail the Guardian Tanar'ri here because there is only one kind and the Molly-Dei will get their own video. But I will say the Guardian Tanar'ri remain faithful to the Blood War and keep all others in line, even the mighty Balors. According to the Advanced D&D 1st Edition Monstrous Manual, the Guardian Tanar'ri hold a higher ranking than the true Tanar'ri, which makes sense considering that they are meant to keep the true Tanar'ri in line. Hellbound the Blood War for 2nd Edition then places the Guardians lower than the true Tanar'ri, yet just over a year later, in Faces of Evil the Fiends, also for 2nd Edition, the Guardian Tanar'ri are once again placed above the true Tanar'ri in terms of hierarchy. True Tanar'ri. The greatest of the abyssal fiends, the true Tanar'ri are the demons that drive the Blood War. This rank includes the Vrox, Glabrizu, Hezru, Nalfeshni, Meriliths, and Balor. The lower Tanar'ri are happy to hack away at each other in meaningless squabbles, but the high-ups see the threat the Beatezu represent. They believe that the Beatorians want to drive the passion out of violence, replacing it with cold, precise cruelty. All true Tanar'ri have individual names. Less powerful fiends carry names as well, but those of the true Tanar'ri are names to conjure by, names by which spells can be woven. No true Tanar'ri are ever born into their place. They all evolve from weaker fiends. Even the Vrock, which hatches from an egg, is created whole in the egg. Any fiend that wants to be a true Tanar'ri has to get there on its own. Maybe that is why the ones that make it are called true Tanar'ri, because they have understood what it is to hate and rage and never know why. The true Tanar'ri take the blood war very seriously. Their desire to see it through inspires the lower ranks, or more accurately, their desire means that they bully the lower ranks into believing the same. The true Tanar'ri see the advance of the Beatezu as an encroachment on the pure chaos they love, or as the Beatezu's attempt to dictate the answer, the real meaning to life. Each Tanar'ri thinks that it and it alone knows this answer. Another way demonologists categorize the Tanar'ri are types, as we briefly mentioned earlier. Most demons fit into one of these 6 major types, with the weakest being categorized as type 1 and the strongest as type 6. Demons outside of these 6 main types are categorized as minor demons or demon lords. The type system is really only seen at Advanced D&D 1st edition and then 5th edition, and for the most part they agree on the demons within each type. Type 1 consists of the Barlgura, Shadow Demon, and the Vrock. The Vrock was the only type listed in Advanced D&D 1st edition, and its appearance this low is funny considering it was considered a true Tanar'ri as of 2nd edition. Type 2 includes the Hezru, and 5th edition included the Kazme. Type 3 had the Glabrezu, and later included the Yoklal. The only Type 4 demon is the Nalfeshni. Type 5 also only has one demon, the Merilith. And finally, Type 6 contains the notorious Baelor, and as of 5th edition, the Garistro. The Tanar'ri are a race bred for evil, corruption, and pain. They revel in bloodshed and are born ready for the hardships of the field. For those unfamiliar with the Tanar'ri, here's an analogy to better understand them and to break down the earlier rankings into easily understood concepts. The Abyssal Lords are the Tanar'ri kings, Baelors are the generals, Meriliths the strategists. Nalfeshni are the judges and torturers. Molidei are the quartermasters and recruiting sergeants. Among the lesser Tanar'ri, Vrock are the aerial scouts and skirmishers. Glabrezu are the spies and power brokers. Hezru, the heavy troops. Armenites, the cavalry. Succubi and incubi are tempters. And mains are peasants. Rudderkin are skirmishers and camp followers. The Tanar'ri treat the Abyss as their storehouse, recruiting center, and free leave. Proxies. Certain Tanar'ri become proxies for the rulers of the Abyss. Proxies are servants of divine beings of at least demigod status. These proxies are granted powers by those they serve that allow them to stand above other creatures. The mightiest proxies of the Abyssal Lords and powers are the true Tanar'ri, whose evil was great and vile enough that they earned powers and status among the Tanar'ri. Lesser Tanar'ri sometimes serve as lesser proxies, but all of them are proud, slothful, avaricious, lustful, enraged, jealous, or gluttonous. They are more devoted to themselves and to their own needs than their patrons, so offering them something that they can use is a good way to distract them. Though they all fear their masters, they have little loyalty. Remember that, because it can be turned against them. Other proxies are rare and usually created for some special purpose. Specially shaped proxies like the Mirrorlokar and Yoklal that serve Lolth, Demogorgon's Ixit Zachatol, and Kotschichi's Frost Mages are generally confined to the layers where they were created. Ascension. Unlike the Beatezu, the Tanar'ri have no set procedures for ascending from one rank to another, and even beyond that, there is no pattern to the evolution of the Tanar'ri. One may start as a Dretch, Mains, or Rudderkin, but where they go from there is anyone's guess. Of course, the Tanar'ri will have a very slow power progression typically, but there is no linear transformation order. In 2nd edition, their promotions hinge on belief, both belief from the candidate and the judges alike. If a Tanar'ri can convince its brethren that it's stronger, more cunning, and more powerful than they are, that perception eventually becomes a reality, and the fiend transforms. It's a strange mix of self-worth and posturing. In this way, even a lowly Mains can rise up to become an abyssal power. The fiend doesn't really have to be as powerful as it pretends to be. If enough others believe, the lie eventually becomes true. Of course, it helps if the fiend has great cunning, deep self-confidence, magical weapons, abnormal strength, or the like to back up its claim to power. Granted, it'll take countless eons of sheer unmitigated evil and the betrayal of everything the fiend holds dear, but in the quest for power, only the desire for more remains. Quite a few people don't believe that faith alone is enough to power the Tanar'ri's transformations. They're certain that other forces, possibly the Balors or the Nalfeshni, channel and manipulate their belief. It is also said that the Tanar'ri work on the Abyss just as it works on them. Their belief feeds the chaos of the plane, and it returns the favor by making them strong. Of course, something that looks like a Balor usually gets treated like a Balor. That is, the other fiends steer clear. But occasionally, lesser Tanar'ri attack one to see if it's really as powerful as they've heard. That's why Knights of the Cross Trade looking to fool the Tanar'ri don't usually do it by going in shape-changed. Some say that the Abyss raises the Tanar'ri to their positions without regard for their ability or brain power. And some groups, like the Fraternity of Order, suspect that a secret order underlies everything. In this case, the pattern isn't apparent, but they say it's there. Which of these theories is true is hard to say. Could be all of them, or none of them. In the Abyss, it's hard to be sure of anything. An ascension can take anywhere from a century to uncounted eons, depending on the drive of the Tanar'ri in question. Usually a Tanar'ri rises only one level at a time. That is, it's nearly impossible for a least Tanar'ri like a Dretch to jump to the status of a greater Tanar'ri in just one incarnation. These gradual increases of power are generally accepted by the demons. Plodding through a succession of shapes lets them experience all the wonderful variations of Tanar'ric existence. Only the most ambitious and devious manage to leap a greater gap, but it's been known to happen. After all, the Tanar'ri don't follow any set promotion ladder. In the Abyss, power equals station. The lowest creatures there, the larvae, learn that quickly, and they evolve towards sentience and strength just as fast as they can, once the Nalfeshni give them their first form, of course. Some of them make it. Others wind up as food for the other Tanar'ri. Force of will counts for a lot, but chance and luck are just as important. Not all Tanar'ri are obsessed with rising to the top. Some of them certainly do desire that level of power and infamy, but a large majority don't care to go through the whole fiendish rat race. Though they may have ambitions of their own, quite a few Tanar'ri are content to wreak havoc on their own personal level. Posturing. At the lower end of the power scale, Tanar'ric politics tend to be that of tooth and nail, which fiend can most effectively destroy another through sheer physical and magical strength. The more fearsome a creature looks, the more likely it is that lesser Tanar'ri avoid it or go align with its wishes. The weaker Tanar'ri don't understand the subtleties of the high-ups. All they know is raw destructive power. While they desire that kind of power, they also shrink away from those that currently possess it, or seem to. So when a higher Tanar'ri wants to communicate with a lower Tanar'ri, it adopts a brutally fierce and intimidating form, something a lesser fiend that equates appearance with strength can understand. Of course, if the higher Tanar'ri meets another Tanar'ri of the same power level, it takes on a more subtly imposing shape. This need to deal with each other on many levels is theorized to be the root of the Tanar'ri's shape-shifting ability in 2nd edition. And interestingly, while the higher Tanar'ri no doubt despised the oppression they suffered at the claws of the higher Tanar'ri when they themselves were in weaker forms, they show no guilt about oppressing others now that they wield the power. They use lesser Tanar'ri to prosecute their eternal vendetta against the Beatezu, and they gather armies to assault anyone who disagrees with them. They reason that if it was done to them, they can do it to someone else. It's a vicious cycle of use and abuse, one that keeps the Tanar'ri both evil and chaotic. Among the highest members of the race, the true Tanar'ri and higher, the political games rely on more than just appearance and cruelty. They depend on posture, gestures, word choice, and scores of factors beyond the comprehension of lesser Tanar'ri. Survival is no longer their only goal. These Tanar'ri seek dominion over the Abyss by extending their wills across the layers. Naturally, since it is every Tanar'ri for themselves, the atmosphere is one of constant paranoia and hatred. The high-ups never know what their foes might be planning, as they move without provocation or forethought. If you think the true Tanar'ri cling stubbornly to their visions of what's best for the Abyss and the rest of the multiverse, you haven't seen anything yet. Beyond that, we have the games of the Abyssal Lords. Each Abyssal Lord holds to a personal vision, and each works at cross purposes with the other. Though they may work together now and then, they expect no less than betrayal from their compatriots every time, and most lords figure it's best to betray the others first. Alliances rise and fall without a single bond of trust. If one lord grows too arrogant or dangerous, the others might band together to take it down a notch or two. They might marshal riotous armies, turn a familiar confidant against the arrogant lord, lock them up in one of these stale bubbles of Pandemonium's Agathion, or banish them to a forbidden lair of the Abyss where even the Tanar'ri know to fear. But, on the other hand, they might fail. In the Abyss, nothing is certain. That's why the politics of the plane are so turbulent. The cardinal rule, a law that even the Tanar'ri manage to obey, is this: trust nothing and no one. Parasites of power. This may be familiar if you watched the full demon video. Some of the weaker Tanar'ri find alternate ways to deal with the harsh ministrations of the stronger. Outright revolt barely succeeds, and the process of advancing to a tougher shape is a slow and difficult one. However, if a lower Tanar'ri wants to immediately find release from the abuse of its betters, it might attach itself to a fiend of importance and become what is known as a parasite of power. The parasites are Tanar'ri that give up their own drives and desires in order to make themselves more useful to one more powerful. They don't change their physical form, they merely surrender their wills. For their chosen master, parasites perform any function, no matter how menial or humiliating, simply because they feel they won't amount to much on their own, and they want to ally themselves with a winner. These Tanar'ri are quite odd indeed. They subjugate themselves utterly just for the privilege of saying they know and serve someone of importance. The truth is, they sacrifice their own chance at gaining that same kind of importance just to associate with a Tanar'ri that's more powerful, destructive, and interesting than they are. By doing so, they hope to make themselves appear to have more of those exact qualities. The parasites learn all they can about their master and emulate its actions whenever possible, down to mannerisms, style of dress, and chosen enemies. Actually, on occasion, mortals have mistaken particularly adept parasites for their overlords. Rumor has it that some parasites eventually overthrow their masters, having learned their lessons too well. If another fiend tries to stand between a parasite and its master, the parasite feigns friendship, or even subservience to the interloper, and then begins to commit its betrayals. And if two parasites go to war over which of them can better serve a mighty Tanar'ri, they do it with relish. Naturally, the Tanar'ri understand each other and know how to best inflict great misery on their kind. Researchers have cataloged parasites ranging in power from the least dretches to Tanar'ri that may have been Abyssal Lords themselves, had they not sacrificed their futures for this fascinating, yet pitiful, display of sycophancy. Think of those extremely powerful, unique servants of demon lords, powerful enough to be lords on their own, yet merely acting beneath another. Now, I'll be making a video entirely on the Blood War at some point, but I'll talk on some of the specifics that deal with the Tanar'ri in this video. The Tanar'ri are one of the two major factions in the Blood War. For as long as the Tanar'ri have existed, they have waged war against their ancient enemies, the Beatezu. They are a horde of chaos and disorder, using theoretically endless numbers in wars of attrition. It's difficult to estimate the Tanar'ri populations, considering they inhabit an infinite number of infinitely large layers, but it's said, however truthful it may be, that there are easily 100 times as many Tanar'ri as Beatezu. Some say that the Blood War is everything that the Tanar'ri live for, that they grow and perish fighting, and fighting, and fighting. And that is true enough for some of the Tanar'ri. The true Tanar'ri push vigorously for the rest of the race to crush the Beatezu out of existence. Vast companies of disorganized armies disembark every day from Durau, the 274th layer of the Abyss, spreading chaos and havoc across the lower planes and sometimes the middle and upper planes too. Like arrows from a bow, the Tanar'ri launch themselves, clawing and screaming, raining down on anything and everything that stands in their way. In this fashion, the Tanar'ri are mowed down by the millions by the steadfast and disciplined Beatezu. But this is the plan of their commanders. They want to get there first and send the lower ranks first to ensure that they are the first ones there. The high-ups use the Tanar'ri on the bottom of the power scale to soften up or even just distract the Beatezu for a while. Once their foes are bruised and bloodied, the high-ups can move in and slay them without nearly as much trouble. Sure, the Tanar'ri lose plenty of troops this way, but the Abyss doesn't seem like it'll run out of new demons anytime soon. No one really knows why the true Tanar'ri are so eager to fight the Blood War. It could be that they feel it's their mission to get rid of the Beatezu, or maybe they just seek to remove the skin of law from the face of evil. Whatever the reason, it's safe to assume that nearly all true Tanar'ri have a vested interest in keeping the war raging. Whether they gain power for themselves or just get to watch their hated enemies crumble, the true Tanar'ri seem only to benefit by forcing the lesser Tanar'ri to fight. But the true Tanar'ri aren't the only force in the Abyss. Many abyssal lords of the layers weigh in on the issue as well. Some, like Sesinek, lock themselves away from the conflict entirely. Others, like Alvarez, hey, I've talked about him, scheme more against their fellows than against the Beatezu. And others, like graz'zt, work to end the Blood War, at least temporarily, so the tides of evil can unite against the forces of good. In reality, there are as many approaches to the Blood War as there are abyssal lords, and not one of them agrees with the others on all the particulars, just like the rest of the Tanar'ri. Some Tanar'ri become bored with the Blood War over the millennia. They hide these unnatural tendencies, and some do regain their bloodlust after time away from the killing fields. As of 3.5e, many Tanar'ri avoid the Blood War, preferring instead to focus on accumulating political influence and magical power within the context of the Abyss itself. They do this by subverting layers to their wills and by attracting followers on the material plane, who then manifest on those layers as petitioner servants when their souls reach the Abyss after death. The most powerful Tanar'ri who follow this path are known as Demon Lords, and their struggles against each other reach nearly every corner of the Abyss. The greatest rivalry is that between Demogorgon, graz'zt, and Orcus, but others, such as Yinagu, Malkenthet, Baphomet, and Zuktmoy, refuse to be forgotten, continually plotting against each other and invading the realms of their neighbors. Despite the rumors one may hear, the Tanar'ri wasted little time on the upper planes, focusing more on their hated Beatezu foes. Though some conflicts have occurred, mostly at the behest of some Demon Lord's plots, and while the Tanar'ri may not bother much with the upper planes, certain Celestials utterly abhor the demons, like the Archons or Celestial Eladrin, but the specifics of those are more related to Celestials, so I'll leave that for another time in another video. Tanar'ri make use of the river Styx as well as lower planar gates, planar doorways somewhere within the lower planes, especially during the Blood War. While the Beatezu use these with discipline and organization, the Tanar'ri enjoy none of these qualities. They swarm to whatever gate's handy, fight over who should procure the key, and probably couldn't find the same gate twice without the assistance of a Yugoloth or canny planeswalker to guide them. That's one reason they use a weapon called the Scythe of Plane Opening, a magical weapon that makes its own gate. Of course, this was mentioned in Advanced D&D 2nd Edition, Hellbound: The Blood War. On the other hand, the Tanar'ri take better advantage of the element of surprise. When they storm through a gate unexpectedly, any Beatezu troops nearby are caught off guard. But the reverse doesn't hold true. The Beatezu gain no upper hand in surprising their foes, as the Tanar'ri just go with the flow and lay into the invaders. Tanar'ri high-ups also occasionally visit Mount Othrys, hoping the Titans will lend their considerable might to their side of the Blood War. While the Titans treat the Tanar'ri with respect, on the surface level at least, it's only because they're hoping some abyssal secret may be their way off the plane of their imprisonment. Once the Titans realize a particular Tanar'ri is of no use to their plans, it takes everything the demon has to escape with its life. Dealing with mortals. Whether you can believe it or not, there is plenty of proof that even the mortals, beings who grow old and die, whether from the prime material or the outer planes, have either enough bravery in their hearts or enough foolishness in their skulls to deal with the Tanar'ri. Some are mages who believe that they have the spells to face a Tanar'ri. Others hope to sell dark secrets, while foolishly refusing to believe that their bindings are next to useless at protecting them from the fiends they are dealing with. The Tanar'ri love to deal with these fools. In the words of Telson Splithorn the Scribe, quote, "Here's a tip for any mortal, prime or planar, thinking of peeling, summoning, or otherwise dealing with the Tanar'ri. Stretch out in front of a thundering herd of Maleficents, or Baku instead. You'll get the same basic result and save yourself a lot of time and hassle." End quote. In all actuality, this advice could be applied when dealing with any fiend, but especially the Tanar'ri. They ignore the rules of engagement, negotiation, and diplomacy, and they're incredibly unpredictable. If you insult a Beatezu or Yugoloth, you'll get an expected result. Likely not a good result, but expected nonetheless. But there's no telling what will happen when dealing with a Tanar'ri, and no use guessing what kind of mood it will be in. It could be generous and beneficent, or, other times, it could maim the nearest creature without a second thought. They aren't bound by laws, contracts, or loopholes, and there's nothing to prevent it from lying or peeling its way out of any deal it wants. The only rule they respect is the rule of force, and half the time, they ignore that too. One example of this is Telson Splithorn's attempt at dealing with the Tanar'ri. See, he wanted immortality and riches beyond his wildest dreams. So, he bound the life force of a Merilith to his own using a method he refused to reveal. He knew the fiend's word wasn't worth dirt, and the Merilith couldn't refuse him as he had her life in his hands. But, while he was expecting her to boldly break her word and try to squash him, he wasn't expecting her to give him his immortality, in the form of turning him into a dretch in her service. That kind of clever monkey's paw is what one would expect from a devil, not a demon. But that just proves the point that every Tanar'ri is the exception to the rule. The Tanar'ri are known to dally with mortals from time to time to create more of their kind through breeding. Cambions, Alufiends, and even Tieflings further down the line are products of such couplings. The mortal partner almost always dies. Females in the painful throes of birth, and males as soon as their seeds take root. In the words of Jezame Roch, quote, "A fool who travels willingly to the abyss deserves what he gets. An Adelcove who deals willingly with the Tanar'ri deserves no more than death. And he'd be lucky to get even that. The Tanar'ri are destructive, petty, and hateful, proud to exemplify all the worst that can come from chaos." End quote. Summoning Tanar'ri. Speaking of dealing with mortals, let's talk about summoning the Tanar'ri. Like the Beatezu, the Tanar'ri desire strength on the material plane. Some are willing to cut deals with the clueless to advance their own aims on the prime. Unlike the Beatezu, however, the Tanar'ri want to establish personal footholds, looking to push their own cause rather than jump through their high-ups' hoops. They do it for themselves. They do it for sheer hateful pleasure. They do it to destroy and to build. They do it because they can. The Tanar'ri are not as vengeful as the Beatezu, nor as coldly malicious as the Yugoloths, but they're 6 times as dangerous. As mentioned earlier, they don't honor the treaties established to bind fiends. All they recognize is the raw power of the spellcaster and the strength of the wards that prevent them from leaving the summoning circle. If the caster messes up the inscriptions for the barrier, any Tanar'ri called won't hesitate to leave the circle and wreak havoc across the plane. The graz'zt are the most commonly summoned true Tanar'ri. A graz'zt is clever, tough, cruel, and willing, the perfect candidate. But one needs a true name to get a graz'zt, or the intervention of a dark deity. Without those, someone will probably end up with a bulezau, or an Armonite instead. Tanar'ri hate being bound to the will of a mortal, but they're intrigued by new experiences. For most of them, ravaging the prime material plane is an entirely new activity. If they can slip away from their summoners, the Tanar'ri often set themselves up as gods or other creatures to be feared. Once in a while, a Tanar'ri is clever enough to hide away, but most can't resist running free in a brand new world. Sometimes they enjoy it so much that a Celestial has to pop in and set things right. A favorite trick of the Tanar'ri is to possess the body of a native of the prime material through the use of a special power much like that of the magic jar spell, at least in 2nd edition anyways. Rumor has it that the mortal form experiences much more sensation than a Tanar'ric form, so the Tanar'ri will simply run wild, gorging themselves on the feelings in their borrowed body. They don't care about the bodies they infest either. And when they've had their fun, or are cast out, if a host gets lucky, they leave their victims with the most profound feeling of having been violated. Demonic possession will be thoroughly covered in a later video, as there is a lot more on that subject. Arcane sources. If you find any black-spined books or flesh-coated tomes that describe how to summon a Tanar'ri, be careful. Only maybe 1 in 1,000 of these books actually contain secrets of binding these creatures of chaos. This is because many of these books are written by the Tanar'ri themselves. They want to trick mortals into summoning them to the prime material, but they don't wish to be chained up once they get there. Tanar'ri prefer being summoned to the prime material plane. Sure, they could just find a planar portal, but that's unreliable and too public. They could be followed by a Beatezu, Celestial, or an enemy with an axe to grind. And if a Tanar'ri pops over to the prime material by its own power, as with a Hezru's planeshift ability, hoping to strike an abyssal bargain, they would just have to track down some mortal greedy enough to do so. If a Tanar'ri is summoned, though, it can do as it likes. It most likely won't be chased by planar enemies, and it always appears right in front of a perfect victim. Though if someone did wish to get accurate literature on summoning Tanar'ri, one of the most trusted sources known to mortals is a volume banned by the Harmonium and Governors, Mors Mysterium Nominum, also known as the Death of the Mysterious Names. This ancient tome is half the height of a full-grown Barrior, wrapped in leather and musty with the scent of ages. It is said to hold the names of all the true Tanar'ri in existence, along with the rituals needed to call and chain them. And more than that, the book supposedly updates itself whenever a true Tanar'ri is formed or destroyed anywhere in the multiverse. Rumor has it that the back sections of the Mors Mysterium Nominum even contain the secret names of the Abyssal Lords, gleaned from the ancient days when the tyrants first rose from the ranks of the Tanar'ri. These sections are hidden from normal sight. Only a creature with the right knowledge and the right key can see them, much less read them. Most of the other books that teach someone how to summon and bind Tanar'ri either draw their knowledge from the nominum or are simply frauds. Spreading the word. It's no secret that the Abyssal Lords actively seek out congregations on the Prime. After all, the Lords can move on to become true deities by gathering the worship of Primes, and that's too sweet an opportunity to miss, even if it's a very difficult task. Some of these lords even go so far as to distribute spells that can summon them to the Prime, hoping that a foolish mage might actually dare to try it. There's a good chance the summoner will be turned inside out for their trouble, but there's an equally good chance that they will be rewarded with magic or service. The Abyssal Lords want to keep folks guessing. If mere mortals can predict their reactions, how much easier would it be for the Beatezu to do so? Baelors eager to begin their rise to lordhood occasionally make their names known as well. They want to be summoned to the Prime so they can work on establishing a base of worship. Ironically, they often struggle to keep their bargains as best they can, at least at first. This is so they can gain a reputation. As they make deals with mortals, their fame will spread, and thus their might will grow. So, in order to establish decent reputations, they will keep the agreements somewhat fair. Of course, once a Baelor gains enough power and worship that it no longer needs to keep its word, watch out. Also, a warning. Any spellcaster who stumbles across one of these Baelor's names had better double-check their sources. Some Baelors find that their true names get spread around by their enemies, so that they're called away from the Abyss at the most inconvenient times. Obviously, anyone who summons one of these furious fiends had better hope their wards are strong and perfectly drawn. Otherwise, they may well find themselves embraced in flames and whisked away to suffer unendurable torments for their folly. There's no telling what a Tanar'ri may do to a summoner on any given day, nor how it might react from moment to moment. Anyone crazy enough to call the Tanar'ri from the Abyss takes their life into their own hands every time they pull a demon out of the gibbering darkness. Population. According to some scholars, the Tanar'ri's numbers are not infinite. They say that Beator's commitment to the Blood War is enough to prove this, that the Beatezu aren't so stupid as to fight an unwinnable war. Instead, two possible schools of thought are offered. First, some say the Abyss may indeed hold an uncountable number of Tanar'ri. Only a finite number, a massively finite number, take part in the Blood War. The rest spend their time inflicting torments, capturing mortals, and competing for strength. Others say that that argument is riddled with holes, that any subset of an infinite number must, by definition, also be infinite. These scholars claim that the Tanar'ri aren't endless in or out of the Abyss. The demons just seem so because they replenish their numbers with blinding speed, which we talked about earlier. The only way to prove or disprove either of these theories is to gather all of the Tanar'ri in one place and try to count them. Until then, the Beatezu continue to fight them, sure beyond certainty that the war can be won. Traitors. The ever-changing, ever-mutable Tanar'ri base their lives on being different from their fellows, on the triumph of individuality over all. Some obsess over the beauties and horrors of the self so much that they tumble into an unusual way to be truly different, embracing goodness within their dark hearts. Most Tanar'ri who do turn good will revel in their new belief for a time, flaunting their new differences if they can get away with it. But, before long, most of these Tanar'ri realize that this goodness is nothing compared to the exquisite horror of their old lives, and they return with an even greater understanding than before. A few, however, make the change and mean it. They stand fast to their new beliefs, learning to wash the evil right out of their body and soul. They are traitors to the abyssal cause, seeking to be different and savoring it so much that they make a mockery of their entire existences. Surprisingly, the Tanar'ri do little to these traitors. Treachery is basically one of the mottos of the Tanar'ri. The demons are used to betrayals, large and small. Sure, they'll avenge themselves when they can, but usually they just let the hatred fester. The Tanar'ri have no time to plan the downfall of a traitor, especially not with their sights more focused on their true enemies, the Beatezu. However, it becomes a different story when a Tanar'ri turns traitor for the Beatezu, and there are, in fact, some stories of Tanar'ri selling out their own kind to the lawful fiends of Beator. But no Tanar'ri in the multiverse would ever give itself fully to the Beatezu, not even if it wanted to. The Tanar'ri might be able to repress their evil in their natures, but they can't hold back the chaos. Not for long, anyways. Diet and sustenance. When it comes to what the Tanar'ri eat, it is just as we expect and fear. They consume meat, and lots of it. Most of the time. They prefer it still living, obviously, and even better, they prefer it scared. Everyone's heard the story that certain animals can smell fear. With the Tanar'ri, it's a known fact. If the fiends can quite literally frighten their prey witless, the flesh and blood takes on a bold new flavor, or so it's said, that is far more satisfying than the meat of calmer victims. They can still get nourishment from prey that isn't terrified, but it's just not as good for them. But there could be some deeper meaning to it. While the Yugoloths like the taste of meat flavored by fear and pain, it's thought that the Tanar'ri eat the fear and pain itself. They relish tearing the meat from the bones of the living because their victims' screams add to the fear felt by other prey. Most predators simply stalk and then kill, but the Tanar'ri add a third step: stalk, terrify, kill. Not to mention the dark tales that arise surrounding the Tanar'ri eating habits. Some Tanar'ri are said to eat the spirits of their fallen foes along with their corpses. Others supposedly draw the magical essence from the bodies. But it's impossible to say which kinds of fiends inflict what types of torments on which sorts of prey. None of them follow any set pattern in their dining habits. It's senseless to try and force the Tanar'ri into neat rows of classification. There's even arguments as to whether the Tanar'ri need to eat or simply choose to do so, either for the simple pleasure or for other purposes. For example, Morezi eat their foes in order to assume their forms, and Vroks devour fallen opponents mostly as a symbolic gesture of superiority, though it also prevents certain fiendish enemies from returning to life. If there is a structure or symbolism to the way the Tanar'ri eat, as there is for the Beatezu and the Yugoloths, no one knows. Unless they intend to instill fear and the reminder of painful mortality in their victims, it could be said that the Tanar'ri eat just as they live, senselessly and destructively. Rest and respite. If the Tanar'ri sleep, they manage to avoid showing it, or else they do it so quickly that it's nearly impossible to notice. They are creatures of constant motion, moving with purposeless aim from one task to the next. They don't ever seem to stop. It's not impossible to catch a Tanar'ri dozing, but many people have never seen it. Perhaps they are aware of the gaze of the observer. Perhaps they simply earn the rest they need between the blinks of an eye, dreaming with every third step they take. That may be why they act as they do. They live in the twin worlds of sleep and wakefulness, never sure which is the dream and which is reality, and they're determined to wreak as much havoc in either. This theory also explains the Tanar'ri's bewildering reaction to so much of the multiverse and their ability to make completely dazzling leaps in insight. If true, it's both their blessing and their curse. Of course, the Abyssal Fiend's strange behavior could just as easily be ascribed to insanity brought on by insomnia. Summoning allies. Most Tanar'ri can call upon an innate gate ability to summon their fellows in times of need. The power works much like the spell of the same name. The fiends open a temporary gate to another location and compels one or more creatures to step through. After all, in the midst of battle, it's not always convenient to wait for reinforcements to come through the nearest gate. But it isn't as easy as it seems. The power is different for each demon. What type of Tanar'ri answers the call, how many of them come, how often the power can be used, the chance of the summoning success. All of these factors vary depending on the might of the one who opens the gate. Of course, wild use of this ability can swell a battle exponentially. One Tanar'ri summons two more, who each call two more, who each call two more, and so on. This is different in newer editions to prevent repeated summonings. But it rarely gets that bad. Most fiends limit their use of gate. See, many fiends can only use it once per day, and they don't want to waste it. Even if their summoning fails, it still counts as their use. But even fiends who can summon more frequently still hesitate before gating in reinforcements. They're not eager to become indebted to those that answer their call, as the summoned fiends normally expect payment for their aid. And some high-up demons don't want to show weakness. They'd rather die in battle than admit that they need help against enemies. 3rd edition is much the same. Tanar'ri can summon others of their kind as though casting a summon monster spell, with only a limited chance of success. On a failed percentile die roll, no Tanar'ri answers the summons. Summoned creatures remain for 1 hour, then return to their homes in the abyss. A Tanar'ri that is itself summoned cannot use its own summon ability for 1 hour. Many Tanar'ri are loath to use their summon ability because doing so leaves them in debt to the Tanar'ri they summon. They only risk owing such a debt if their own lives are at risk. Between their arrogance and disdain for owing favors to one another, however, Tanar'ri are often reluctant to use this power until they are in obvious peril. Teleportation. Most Tanar'ri have the innate ability to teleport in 2nd edition. This worked like Teleport Without Error, the 7th level wizard spell. Though demons didn't use this ability as much as you'd assume. In fact, they often avoided hopping all over the planes. For starters, a creature teleporting without error can do nothing else on that round. The trip takes the wind out of them. They also have no say in how they're facing when they appear. Fiends hate being at an opponent's so-called mercy. Also, there are some highly magical places that are simply off-limits to teleportation. For example, Oinos, the first layer of the Grey Waste, does not allow anyone to just pop in, making the fiends reach that battleground by more conventional means. Most importantly, teleportation without error is a bit of a misnomer. When teleporting anywhere on the demon's home plane, the power works just fine. But when teleporting to another plane, they must be familiar with where they are going, or it risks appearing hundreds of feet above ground or buried inside tons of rock. Even with a crystal clear picture of a very familiar destination, the power still fails 3% of the time. If it's never seen the intended site, the power fails 48% of the time. Usually the chance for error falls between the extremes. But the fiends figure that they're pushing their luck if they pop all over the place without care. On another plane, anyways. So demons try not to teleport unless it's necessary. Of course, now and then a strike force jumps right where it needs to go, or a high-up blinks away when it's about to be ripped limb from limb by an enemy. But the Tanar'ri know that abusing the power can only lead to trouble. However, for a while, something was going wrong with the fiend's ability to teleport. First, only newly created fiends found themselves without the teleport without error ability. But then, all Beatezu and Tanar'ri were suddenly stripped of the power. They didn't, and most likely still don't, know the truth of the trouble, but the fiends are too proud to admit weakness. While they were without this power, they just pretended to choose not to teleport about, often claiming that the act of physically crossing the lower planar ground somehow binds the land to their will, and whether this has any truth to it, none can say, though there may be some merit to this that we will cover in the Demon Lord video. It's best not to bring this up to the Tanar'ri. They are remarkably touchy about this subject, and some poor souls bear the scars to prove it. The truth of this matter relates to the Maeldur et Kavarik that we touched on earlier. It was through the grace of the Maeldur that the Beatezu and Tanar'ri were able to teleport across the plains at will, just by allowing the Maeldur to know the fiend's name. The Yugoloths eventually decided to rein in their allegedly purged offspring. With the aid of the Maeldur et Kavarik, the Yugoloths plan to strip the warring fiends of their teleport without error power, then to restore it only to those who swear obedience. Wishing to remain in shadow, the Yugoloths leaked carefully planned rumors to the upper planes. They hoped to lead the champions of good into unwittingly carrying out their schemes for them. Long story short, this worked. The Maelder had its memories erased, thus removing the power from the fiends, and in order to get the power back, they'd need to swear fealty to the Yugoloths. There is more to this story, but nothing really related to demons specifically and the Tanar'ri. I'll talk about it more when I eventually cover the devils and Yugoloths. The lack of organization among the Tanar'ri means that very few have realized the truth that all Tanar'ri lost this ability. Most Tanar'ri think that they are the only ones having this problem with teleportation, at least at the time 2nd edition scholars were making records. But most of the Tanar'ri don't really care. Powers come, powers go. That's chaos. They have plenty of other ways to get around the multiverse. As of Advanced D&D 1st Edition, true and greater Tanar'ri roamed often in the astral and ethereal planes, and were attracted by those in an ethereal state. Magical abilities. As reported in original Dungeons & Dragons Eldritch Wizardry, some common abilities of the demons were infravision, the ability to teleport with no chance of error, cause darkness with varying degrees of effectiveness depending on the demon, and the ability to open a gate with varying chances of success according to the type. Common abilities listed in Advanced D&D 1st Edition are as follows. Demons types 1 through 3 are affected by non-magical weapons. Types 4 and greater are not affected by non-magical weapons. The same infravision, darkness, and teleportation as original D&D. They take full damage from acid, iron weapons, magic missile, and poison. Half damage from cold, electricity, magic and dragonfire, and poisonous gas. Silver weapons only hurt demons the same as non-magical weapons, meaning the greater Tanar'ri took half damage from silver weapons on average, and some of the more powerful Tanar'ri were unaffected. These were all generic demon traits that I've repeated here just for reference. 2nd edition is where the Tanar'ri were mentioned specifically. 2nd edition changed a few minor things. 2nd edition specifies that iron weapons must be cold wrought iron. Now, this doesn't mean an iron weapon that is cool to the touch. Many fools learn that truth the hard way. The dead way, in the words of Graz'zt the Blue Slad. A cold wrought iron weapon is one that has gone through a special forging process. It's available at most blacksmiths, especially in Sigil, according to Graz'zt. It hurts the Tanar'ri, and it also does the same to a number of other creatures. Many things do not like the sting of cold wrought iron. There are 3 main reasons that not all planeswalkers carry such weapons at all times. Firstly, many beings think that cold iron weapons are primitive. Secondly, the weapons do not work so well against enemies with no special weaknesses to them. Steel works better in those cases. And finally, the third reason is that the Tanar'ri tell everyone the first 2 reasons, to try and get people to stop using cold wrought iron. That way, the Tanar'ri have one less thing to worry about. Also in 2nd edition, magical acid burns all Tanar'ri except the alkalith. Normal acid works on some Tanar'ri, but some shrug it off pretty easily and others are completely immune. Holy water and holy weapons work nicely. The weapons work especially well if enchanted or made of wrought iron. 2nd edition Tanar'ri had resistance to cold, gas, and magical fire. Electricity, poison, and non-magical fire did not hurt the Tanar'ri at all. And yet again, magic weapons work well, but some work better than others. A weapon that may hurt a Dretch may tickle or anger a Balor. Of course, no 2 Tanar'ri are the same. Sometimes the thing that works on one Tanar'ri may not work on another of the same type category. Some Tanar'ri take a liking to a mortal who tries to kill them and fails. They find it humorous that an insignificant worm imagines they have power over a fiend. They laugh even as they turn the mortal inside out. According to the Advanced D&D Monstrous Manual, the abyss-forged magical weapons of the Tanar'ri frequently dissolved upon the death of that creature. When one didn't, the weapon most likely originated somewhere else. In 3rd edition, Tanar'ri were immune to poison and electricity and had resistance of 20 to acid, cold, and fire. This meant that acid, cold, and fire damage were reduced by 20, and if it didn't exceed 20 damage, it just didn't do any damage to the Tanar'ri. In 3.5e, however, the Tanar'ri have the same immunities, poison and electricity, but only resistance 10 to acid, fire, and cold, with the stipulation that some types of Tanar'ri may differ from this baseline. Telepathy. Because they have a special form of telepathy, demons are able to understand every intelligent communication. Demons with average or better intelligence are likewise able to converse. 2nd edition, Faces of Evil the Fiends, further describes a Tanar'ri's ability to communicate. According to this source, most Tanar'ri have the ability of telepathic communication, otherwise known as mind speak. Most being the key word. Mains are too witless to communicate at all, and it's said that some Tanar'ri at random may not have picked up the ability yet. Those that haven't must present themselves before a high-up, so said high-up can simply pluck whatever information is needed right from their heads. Blood War mercenaries report that the range of this mind speak is about 1,000 yards, even across crowded battlefields. A forceful mental shout can deafen a receiver's mind for a moment, much like the ringing left after shouting in someone's ear. Though the mind speak doesn't disrupt spellcasting or harm the target. It simply informs the unfortunate recipient that a Tanar'ri wishes to speak with them. The Tanar'ri can use this to communicate with any intelligent race, for the messages rely more on symbols and concepts than words. The lower Tanar'ri, unable to express complex ideas, usually project symbols that are harsh and crude. Cannier Tanar'ri learn to translate these symbols into intelligible concepts that non-Tanar'ri can more easily understand. But be warned, sometimes these fiendish symbols can burn themselves into the receiver's mind, leaving them permanently scarred. Naturally, the Tanar'ri take great joy in this. Tanar'ri can speak verbally. As of 2nd edition, it was said that the Abyssal Fiends are far too diverse to have drawn together a unifying racial language. But they did shout and threaten aloud. The lower Tanar'ric vocal speech resembles the barking of canines, yapping incessantly as they vie for attention. More refined Tanar'ri speak in the soft drone of ocean waves, coupled with the violence of a disturbed wasp's nest. Occasionally, a Baelor yelps in jangled dissonance, and a Barlgura murmurs in a smooth susurrus. As with everything else about the Tanar'ri, their use of speech can't be predicted. One thing's true universally, though. Their vocal patterns aren't as direct as telepathy and tend to reveal the point of origin of the speaker. Among the fiercely territorial fiends, that can be a death sentence. When deciding between vocal or telepathic communication, the Tanar'ri use whatever method is most convenient or effective, or whatever they feel like using at the time. Some Tanar'ri, usually those who deal with mortals regularly, like the Alufiends, Cambions, and the Succubi, have mastered one or more mortal languages, but the bulk of the Tanar'ri just make noise. The Tanar'ri are a deconstructionist's dream. They don't ever fully understand the speech of another fiend, and it goes without saying that they are not fully understood either. When mortal scholars try to learn the Tanar'ri language, they usually focus on the dialects of one or two of the chaotic fiends, but even then it's a frustrating task. That may well be part of the reason the Tanar'ri are so angry all the time. They're constantly and fundamentally misunderstood. That may also explain why the Tanar'ri often resort to methods of communication that can't be misconstrued, like torture. 3rd edition simplifies the explanation by giving all Tanar'ri the ability to communicate telepathically with any creature within 100 feet that has a language, a much shorter range than the earlier reported 1,000 yards. In 3.5e, telepathy is the default for the Tanar'ri, but the range is specified in each creature's individual monster entry. Truth be told, there's not really any such thing as a standard ability of the Tanar'ri. Their makeup all but precludes such a statement. However, two special powers pop up repeatedly among the chaotic fiends, the ability to see in the dark and the ability to create darkness itself. And that's all that could be predicted with any measure of certainty. Of course, this was the standard for 2nd edition. The Monstrous Compendium Appendix says all Tanar'ri, even the least, had these abilities. The list of standard powers isn't nearly as long for Tanar'ri as it is for the Beatezu. But then again, the individual breeds of Tanar'ri have also shown themselves to possess more unique abilities than the Beatezu could ever know. As of 2nd edition, most Tanar'ri got to enjoy some level of resistance to magic. This caused magical attacks cast on the fiend to fail before the demon even had to make a saving throw. True Tanar'ri mostly had a magic resistance of 70%. The Guardian Tanar'ri, the Mali Dei, had a staggering 90% magic resistance, and just for reference, Greater Beatezu devils, like the Pit Fiend, only had a 50% magic resistance. If this is the case, why would anyone bother using magic items or spell-like powers at all? Well, no one ever knows when they may get lucky, and no foe is completely resistant to magical attack. And some fiends learned to wield magic more creatively. Commanders on both sides of the Blood War use walls of fire or ice and similar spells to form channeling boundaries that herd the enemy in the desired direction. Fire was more so used by the devils because they were mostly immune to fire. Walls could also be used to protect groups' flanks from onrushing foes. And the Tanar'ri laugh off many other forms of attack, either completely immune or suffering reduced damage, as mentioned earlier. 2nd edition Tanar'ri were immune to poison, electricity, and lightning, and suffered half damage from gas attacks, and could be hurt by iron weapons. The magic resistance and damage immunities of the fiends resulted in an interesting development from both Tanar'ri and Beatezu. Knowing that most of their innate spell-like powers are useless in the Blood War, some fiends have turned to casting learned spells like mortal wizards. Others have worked at developing new innate abilities to replace those that have been less useful to them. Tanar'ri spellcasters. The chaotic Tanar'ri find it difficult to become wizards. Nevertheless, a decent number of them strive to overcome their unfocused nature and learn spellcasting, if only to then use this focused magic to cause more chaos. The most common Tanar'ric wizards are Cambions and Alufiends of a high intelligence. That's not to say full-blooded demons don't take to spellcasting. Succubi make great use of spells for their subtle manipulative schemes. Glabrezu are direct and destructive with magic. Naltheshni usually focus necromancy for undead servants, and so on. I'll detail the spellcasting specialities of each demon in their individual videos. But you really have to look out for Balor and Merilith wizards. Balors were said to be able to reach up to 20th level in Wizard, and their battles with pit fiends have been known to lay waste to huge areas. And Meriliths can potentially cast with two arms while still attacking with their others. Many Tanar'ri wizards become wild mages. In 2nd edition, even wizards have access to wild magic, while others like to dabble in invocation/evocation or conjuration/summoning magic. Illusion, which as of 2nd edition was enhanced in the Abyss, abjuration, and enchantment/charm spells are often, but not always, too subtle for fiends. Tanar'ri priests. Of all fiends, Tanar'ri have the most priests among their number. Their societal structure is far less rigid, so Tanar'ri who pledge to serve a power don't need to worry about angering a high up. Of course, that same chaos means that the Tanar'ri aren't effective servants. They're unlikely to remain loyal to a chosen deity. Only direct threats from the proxies of the deities keep the Tanar'ri priests in line. But the chaotic gods of the plane don't mind seeing their servants in the throes of disarray. and if a priest here or there goes rogue, the Abyss holds plenty of new recruits. Tanar'ri priests are eager to show off their allegiances. The fiends don't just wear symbols like mortal clerics, they physically scar themselves with marks of their deities. Some fashion weapons into the symbol of their god, others praise their god's horrid glories by screaming obscenities as they charge into battle. Tanar'ri priests prefer to serve abyssal lords that have ascended to godhood, Baphomet of the Minotaurs, Dread Demogorgon, Faceless Juiblex, and the Gnoll god Yinogu. Lords who have not become true deities can offer spells only up to 3rd level or 4th if granted in person. These lords attract followers among the lower hit die Tanar'ri who can't reach high priest levels anyways. Of course, this was 2nd edition. Some of these lords have been disposed of, or we've discovered they aren't actually deities, but I'll talk more about the granting abilities from abyssal lords in the Demon Lord video. Tanar'ri priests often receive positions of command. The lords like to have these visible servants at the front of an offensive. Priests attack clerics of other faiths whenever possible, especially those of good-aligned deities. The Tanar'ri would love to get their claws on a Beatezu priest, but the devils are more secretive about their allegiances. So clashes between fiend clerics aren't overly common. No matter what power they are dedicated to, Tanar'ri temples are abominable places of death, sacrifice, and torture. Often they are huge sites of decadent debauchery, built on a grandiose scale that suggests a profane, desecrated, Gothic cathedral that might have once been dedicated to a good power. Many Tanar'ri have the use of a form of magical fear. Some Tanar'ri need to touch the target, some need only get close, and a few just need to be seen by the target. Of course, this same ability most of the time won't affect other Tanar'ri. According to the 2nd edition Hellbound the Blood War, while in a huge messy clash in the Blood War, the Tanar'ri are too battle crazy to be driven off by any fear powers from their enemies. But if fiends of different types encounter each other outside a battle, for example in the city of Sigil, if they were to get into a brawl, they would be susceptible to the fear effects of other fiends. They can't just whip up the same battle frenzy on their own. In more recent editions, like 5th edition, some Tanar'ri just have flat-out immunity to the frightened condition. 2nd edition also provided more specific requirements for a magical weapon to hit a Tanar'ri. For example, a Barbatsu is wounded only by a +1 weapon or better, and a Balor can only be hit with a +3 or better enchantment. Also, any creature that could only be hit by a +whatever weapon can hit a target as if they were using the same enchantment, even with only their fangs and claws. Following our earlier example, that means a Barbatsu can hit an enemy as if it has a +1 weapon, and a Balor can hit as if using a +3 weapon. As of 2nd edition, this bonus didn't add to its attack roll, just its damage in addition to allowing it to hit creatures with immunities to non-magical weapons. And it doesn't add to a weapon's current enchantment. A Barbatsu wielding a +1 longsword still only has a +1 enchantment. The enchantments don't stack for the Tanar'ri. This also affects the Blood War. Despite the overwhelming numbers of the Tanar'ri, the devils can hold their own simply by using their brains, placing devils that are immune to lesser enchantments in battle with hordes of lower-ranked Tanar'ri, whereas the Tanar'ri mostly just rush in, slashing at enemies randomly. The Tanar'ri don't have the arsenal to outfit a unit with magical weapons strong enough to bring down any opponent. Sometimes an amulet of superiority is used, which makes it possible for even lower-level fiends to attack even the most powerful opponents. And a creative Tanar'ri can neutralize an opponent through means that don't involve direct damage, wrapping them in magical bonds, dropping them off a cliff, burying it in a choking, suffocating mass of manes, and more. In combat, Tanar'ri are fierce fighters, never accepting surrender and never submitting, except as a trick or for perverse amusement. They'll often play with weaker opponents, torturing them before devouring them. Against stronger foes, they deliver the best attacks they can, then flee rather than put themselves at unnecessary risk. And there we have it, the complete lore of the Tanar'ri demons. Somehow the lore of just the Tanar'ri is as plentiful, if not more so, than demons in general. Anyways, if you've enjoyed this video and want to learn more about demons, you could check out the playlist or subscribe to catch my future videos. Plus, subscribing or leaving a like would really help the channel grow. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!